our session, I would like to remind you that flash photography is neither needed nor permitted in this venue. I would request you to keep your phones on silent, and if you must take an urgent call, to do so outside of the venue. Please do not leave your bags unattended, as the festival is unable to take responsibility for any loss. Please ensure your phones are placed on silent mode, again for emphasis. One last thing, you stand a chance to win JLF goodies. You can tweet using the hashtag ZJLF. The more you tweet, the more points you get. Exciting prizes are up for grabs. For more details, you can visit the information desk. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to introduce our speakers for today's discussion, titled The Peace to End All Peace. Please welcome Eugene Rogan, Margaret MacMillan, Ronald Suny, and Anthony Sattin in a discussion moderated by Vedica Kant. The sponsor for this session is the Rajasthan Patrika series.
I'm going to check if my mic is working. It looks like it is. I'll start off by introducing our speakers today. It's a very exciting panel, and it's really great to see so many of you turn out to come and hear them speak. To my left, I have Professor Ronald Suny, who's a distinguished university professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's done a lot of work on Russian history and the history of the Caucasus, and has recently published a book on the Armenian genocide. To his left is Professor Margaret MacMillan, who's the warden of St. Anthony's College and a professor of international history at the University of Oxford. Very specific to this panel, she's written a wonderful book on the Paris Peace Conference and the way in which the peace was settled post the First World War. So we'll be picking her brains about that. To her left, we have Anthony Sattin, who's an author, journalist, and broadcaster who specializes on the history of North Africa and the Arab world. His latest book is on young Lawrence. And to his left, we have Professor Eugene Rogan, who's professor of modern Middle Eastern history at the University of Oxford, and has written The Arabs, a History, and most recently, The Fall of the Ottomans, the Great War in the Middle East. I won't waste any time and kind of get the conversation started. I'll address the first question to Professor MacMillan. When we talk about the First World War, it's a period I've researched quite a bit. It's something that everyone talks about when they talk about the war, the ways in which the war changed the world, the way in which global politics changed, the ideas of imperialism and nationalism really come to a head, ideas of self-determination come to a head, and that's quite relevant for the Middle East as well. I thought I'd ask you to kind of set the stage for us in a way by talking a bit about what was the tenor of those discussions on the global stage at that time.
Thank you, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I think we have to go back and remember just what a tumultuous event the First World War was. It literally is a watershed in modern history. Things are different after it, and I think it changes it, as you said, it changes the world. It was an enormously costly war, as you know. Some 9 million men died in that war. We don't know how many more were wounded. People died of starvation as a result of the war, and then, of course, at the end of the war, there was the huge influenza epidemic, which carried off even more people. And so, not only that, but empires were destroyed. Russia had a revolution, and what had been a Russian empire fell to pieces. The old Austro-Hungarian Empire at the heart of Europe fell to pieces, and all this happened as a result of the war. It might not have happened otherwise. And the Ottoman Empire was in the process of falling to pieces as the war came to an end. And so I think there really was a feeling that the world was changing very fast. It was also a war in which people moved around the world. So many people were involved in that war. Ottoman soldiers, Indian soldiers, which of course Vedica knows so much about, soldiers from my own country, Canada, from Australia. It was a war that really did shake Western societies and shake the societies that were drawn into it, and shake, of course, the Ottoman Empire. As the war ended, there was this feeling that a world had been shattered, but also, I think, a feeling of great opportunity, that suddenly long suppressed desires and wishes, perhaps for an independent state if you were an Armenian, or if you were an Arab, or if you were a Hungarian, or if you were a Pole. In some cases, these peoples had had their states before, but suddenly there seemed to be an opportunity. And so what you get at the end of the war is this tremendous sense of fluidity, of loss, but also of opportunity. And there are really competing ideas about how the world should be shaped, which affect the settlements that are made. And the settlements are made in Paris and other European capitals, but they're also being made on the ground by people fighting and pushing. Because if you want your own country, this is your chance to push out the borders as much as you possibly can. And of course, what is going to lead to so much trouble is that so many people could claim the same territory, which is why the peace settlements led to a whole series of smaller conflicts. And if you want to identify two main ideas, and they're the ones that Vedica mentioned that really are competing here, one is the idea that there should be a new type of world, expressed very eloquently by the American President Woodrow Wilson, and that people should determine their own fates, and this notion of self-determination becomes something he doesn't talk much about, but he certainly opens the door for it, and lots of other people talk about it. If you are a people who define yourself as a nation, and that itself is full of problems, but others can talk about that, then you want to have your own state. A sense of being a nation almost inevitably leads to a demand for a separate state with its own borders and with its own administration. But what you also have is the sense that the Western powers still should control the fate of the world. I mean, you have people like the Prime Minister of Britain, David Lloyd George, like Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, who still, and I think many of their advisors are still thinking in a way in which they thought in the 19th and early 20th century that they were the most powerful, most advanced, most civilized parts of the world, and that they had a responsibility, but they also had the right to settle the fate of other peoples around the world who simply could not rule themselves. And so what you get, I think, in the settlements that are made, and you see this so clearly in the case of the former Ottoman territories, you get a real pull between respecting the wishes of those who live there. And the Americans, I think, are more prepared to do that than anyone else, although they still, I think, have something of an imperialist instinct. And then you get the view of the great European powers on the winning side, the British and the French, that really it is up to them to sort out what those people out there are going to live in, what their countries are going to be like. And so this is going to help to make those settlements very, very difficult. I think they would have been difficult in any case because there was such a fluidity. But you do have these clashing principles, which I think are still, in a way, being played out.
Yeah, I'm just going to, with that kind of setting of the stage, kind of zoom in to the Middle East in particular. I'd asked the organizers to put up a map, and I don't know if you can see it yet, but what I wanted to do is show you, what the Middle East looked like in 1914 and what it looked like after 1914 in 1922. Eugene, I wanted to come to you, especially because of your most recent book, talking about the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We today kind of seem to forget that it was mostly Ottoman territory in the Middle East, and the decisions that the empire makes are quite crucial to what the post-war world looks like. I thought I'd ask you to perhaps speak to the audience a bit about, what was the Ottoman Empire like in 1914? What pushes the empire to enter the war? What are the motivations behind that decision to enter the war? I know it's a complicated question, but...
Very small question, very brief answer. And I have a terrible feeling we're all in the wrong event.
Yeah.
I keep hearing the cheering behind us, and either someone's scoring goals or centuries. I'm not sure what's going on out there. But for those of us who are staying with the First World War, let me talk a little bit about where the Ottoman Empire fit into world affairs in 1914, because we talk about a world war, but really the assassination in Sarajevo should have led to a European conflict. It's what everyone had expected. There was a sense that there were issues that rival powers in Europe needed to sort out amongst themselves, and more felt that war was the way forward.
Yeah.
For the Ottomans, nothing could have been further from their thinking, because since 1908, when they had a constitutional revolution, they'd gone through 3 wars. They'd squarely lost 2 of them.
Yeah.
They had, in the course of those 3 wars, lost their last North African territory in Libya. They had lost pretty much all of their remaining European territories in the Balkan. In sustaining those war efforts, they had exhausted their economy, and they'd shattered their army.
Yeah.
So in 1914, it wasn't just German arrogance that led the head of the German military mission to declare the Ottomans as a terrible ally who would only be a liability for any country they might be allied to. Lehman was cautioning his government, Germany, against entering into an alliance with the Ottoman Empire just on those grounds.
Yeah.
But the Ottomans knew in 1914 that they had one neighbor who really aspired to key Ottoman territory, and that was Russia. And as early as February of 1914, the Tsar and his government had designated policy to, at the first opportunity provided by war, secure the strategic straits linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and to regain Constantinople, ancient Byzantine capital, inconveniently the Ottoman capital, Istanbul, for an Orthodox restoration. And so the Ottomans in 1914 were not keen to enter a war, but they were desperate for an ally who might protect them against Russian ambitions.
Yeah.
And I think that's what sets the fateful cycle in motion that draws the Ottomans into a war in which they really had no fight.
Yeah. I'd kind of expand from there. We know why the Ottomans were thinking of entering the war, but kind of come to both of you again and ask, what was it that pulled other empires into the Middle East beyond the fact that they were just, now at war with the Ottomans? What were the motivations for wanting to make the Middle East a full-blown campaign? They could have perhaps focused on certain fronts versus other fronts. What were those motivations for the Russians, the British, and the French?
There was a real conflict because the Ottoman Empire was basically weak and was up for grabs. But there were sort of two prongs to European imperial ambitions. One was, will we divide this empire up and each get a piece?
Yeah.
But might that lead us to war with one another? Or should we make some kind of agreement and try to keep the empire together just because we don't know who will get what?
Yeah.
And in 1914, there was an agreement between great European powers, including Russia, that if we impose a kind of reform on that damned Armenian question and force the empire to accept inspectors in eastern Anatolia, then we can keep the empire, at least for the time being, and prevent a war between all of these pieces, between all the powers. Well, what actually happened was the Ottomans had their own, the Young Turks had their own ambitions. And they were searching around, as Eugene so well put it, for some kind of ally. And Germany seemed a really potential one. But there's a really interesting moment when they agree with the Germans, we're going to be your allies. And then the leader of the Young Turks, Talat, goes to Crimea. We all know where Crimea is nowadays, right? And actually,
hopefully we all know where
yes,
Crimea is.
and all talk about, and he goes there and he speaks to Nicholas II, the emperor, and to Sazonov, the foreign minister, and says, you know what, we could give up this German alliance if you would agree on our terms to an alliance with you, but give up the reform that's going to benefit these Armenians in the east. And the Russians and the British say no. So the Germans seem preferable, they go back. But these guys were quite tricky. And they were willing to negotiate and feign back and forth as to which side they would agree to. Ultimately, they went with the Germans. Ultimately, that would lead to disaster.
And if you just step back a little bit earlier, about 8 years before the start of the First World War, there was a strong alliance between Britain and the Ottomans.
Yeah.
So 8 years in that period leading up to the First World War, it really wasn't clear which way the Ottomans would go.
So do you think once the Ottomans decide to go with the Germans, for Britain and France now, it's a weak empire, it's up for grabs, let's start making deals for what piece goes to whom, in a way? Would you say that's the case?
Well, as soon as the war starts. But remember, the Ottomans don't enter the war straight away. I mean, they wait, I think there's sort of 8 or 10 weeks of war. Not until October do the Ottomans finally enter the war, and on the German side. And really with the Germans, I mean, the weeks leading up to that, the Germans saying, well, why haven't you? Why haven't you? We have this agreement. Why haven't you started hostilities?
I think there's a feeling that a lot of countries who are on the sidelines have, that as the war goes on, the stakes are going to get higher and higher. And if they're not in there, they won't have a place at the table at the end. I mean, that's why Italy comes in, that's why Greece comes in, that's why I think the Ottoman Empire comes in. But the interest that the British and the French and the Russians and the Italians and the Germans all have in the Ottoman Empire goes back before the First World War, because it's so evidently weak. And the question is, if it is going to fall to pieces, who gets what? I mean, there's not much sense that the local people in the Ottoman Empire should make up their own minds about this. The sense is, we can't let this go. And for the British, what is crucial is protecting their route out to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And so they don't want a troubled Middle East under the hands of someone else. I mean, the British spend a lot of time during the war trying to make sure the French, their loyal ally, don't get big bits of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. And the French are doing rather the same. And of course, what also complicates it is the discovery of oil, because oil is becoming the fuel for navies, among other things. They're switching over from burning coal to burning oil. And so oil is becoming a crucial strategic element. And where do you get oil from? You get it from Romania, but those wells are difficult to get at in the course of the First World War because they're in an area where there's fighting. And increasingly, you get it from the Middle East. You're getting it from Persia. They're beginning to explore, they were beginning to explore in the Ottoman Empire in what became Iraq before the First World War. And so there are all sorts of reasons why the European powers, and the ones that win are the ones who are going to, in the end, of course, say what they want, why Britain and France do not want to see the Middle East either dominated by one or the other of them. They're prepared to do a deal. They also don't want to see the Middle East left to its own devices because they fear for what might happen to their own strategic interests.
I kind of want to come back to the point you started your comments with, the kind of the pull and push between imperialism and the kind of nationalisms that you have at this period, and that's something you see here as well. So you have, you know, Britain and France wanting to divide up the empire in certain ways, but then you have, you know, the Arabs, for example, the Armenians, the Kurds, they have their own agendas on the ground, and there's a conflict at times between those various agendas, and that's something you see playing out later on in the war. Eugene, Anthony, and Ronald, I think I'll ask all of you perhaps to come in and weigh in on, you know, what did the war mean for the minority populations or the non-Turkish populations of the empire? What did it mean in terms of, you know, opening up that prospect of self-determination? What did it mean in terms of nationalisms and the growth of nationalisms in the empire?
Well, I think we have to remember the Ottoman Empire had ruled over the Arab lands since the 1500s. So by the time of the First World War, it was a 4-century reality that made it very difficult for people in the Arab world to imagine a post-Ottoman reality. And the one thing after the Balkan experience of nationalism leading to fragmentation and loss of territory, the Ottomans were very intolerant of any expression of separatist or national ideas. So they, for decades, have been clamping down on any Arabist expression to ensure that the Arabs didn't go the way of the Balkans. And by the time the First World War breaks out, people in the Arab world are thinking about what their aspirations are, but in very narrow terms because they didn't have the freedom to exchange ideas in newspapers or in public meetings. And they were also quite nervous about European intentions. They knew that France had real aspirations over the Syrian regions. They'd known that since the 1860s. And so the interesting thing is, even Arabists on the eve of the First World War were still Ottomanist in their outlook. Most of them had adopted a position that the Ottoman Empire should reform and the Arab world should stay in that Ottoman Empire, but as a sort of dual monarchy on the Austro-Hungarian model. That you'd have an Arab-Turkish empire, and that the Arabs would stay an integral part of that, but within the Arab provinces, they would be predominant in administrative posts. They would have, their language would be used in public life. And the interesting thing is, in the course of the First World War, when the Arab revolt breaks out, about which Anthony is the expert, these beliefs are put to a test because the Sharif of Mecca is calling for an Arab revolt. And he's appealing particularly to Arabist officers in Ottoman service. And we know from some of the memoirs of these men that they had huge debates in 1916 amongst themselves. They reject the Sharif's call because he's calling for independence. And they're afraid he will lead them into European domination and colonization. They, as Arabists of the secret Ahad society, had always aspired for this reform of a dual monarchy and keep the Arab provinces under the Ottoman Empire to stay out of European control. So, I mean, I think, Vedica, we can even question that nationalist underpinning in these times.
But I do think there is there was a growing Arab identity. In 1912, there was the first Arab Congress in Paris. And the discussion is, well, who are we? What are we? And are you an Arab if you live in the Arab lands? Do you have to be a Muslim? Do you have to are you an Arab if you speak Arabic? So a sense of, being able to identify what is an Arab in that Ottoman entity. And I agree. I mean, there was no sense of any resolution passed at that Congress of anyone calling for separation from the Ottomans. I mean, and interestingly, the Zionists were there at the conference as well, because they were clearly going to be part of, if there was going to be some renewal in that region under the Ottomans, it would involve the Zionists as well. But when the war comes, there's a sense of, well, we can do something, maybe something else can come out of this. And the British, referring to your point of nationalism and imperialism, is the British who stoke that in a way by, on the one hand, having a sort of a big regional agenda, but on the other hand, encouraging the Sharif of Mecca to raise his standard and come out with his independence, because the British needed Arab soldiers. There weren't enough British troops or Indian troops in the region to fight on that huge expanse. So you had that sense of the empire and nationalism sort of coming into conflict because of British duplicity.
Yeah. I think in some ways we all fall into the trap of seeing nationalism as bigger than it really was before the First World War. And that's understandable. History is a social science which came up with the nation state, was complicit in making the nation state. And so nationalists and historians often collaborate together in a funny, maybe sometimes unconscious way. And I think following what my colleagues have been saying, this war, you don't have to be a Leninist to say this, but this war is an imperialist war, or it's a war between imperial powers, right? In the course of that war, and I think this is what Anthony just was mentioning, imperial powers stoked nationalist movements. Yeah. They did it in Ukraine. They did it in Poland. And the Tsarist Empire did it with Armenians, and the British with the Arabs. So we might be exaggerating the role of nationalism as an instigator, but it is certainly something that's being fueled at this time. But what we have often, as historians, called the age of nationalism, even driving it back to the French Revolution, is much more an age of empires competing with one another, sometimes utilizing nationalism. And remember, the sun, and you know this better here in India than anywhere, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire until well after the Second World War, not the First World War.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But kind of coming back to that point about the ways in which imperialism stokes nationalism, and your point about British duplicity, in a way, we love talking about British duplicity here.
Got three people from Britain here.
Canadian.
Yeah, that's right.
But one of the things that is quite striking when you kind of talk about the First World War, especially in the Middle East, is the various kind of agreements, treaties, secret pacts that are being made. And I thought Eugene and Anthony, I'd ask you, and Professor MacMillan, please jump in as well, about what were some of these, we all hear now about Sykes-Picot, but that wasn't the only one. There was the Balfour Declaration. There was also the letters between the Sharif of Mecca and McMahon, if I'm not wrong. So I thought I'd ask you to perhaps talk to the audience about some of these correspondences that were going on, and the ways in which the powers were thinking about dividing the Middle East from the very beginning of the war, and were thinking of co-opting those nationalisms towards their own ends, and how those didn't always, they were quite often at odds with each other and what they were promising to various people.
Vedica, your questions are ones that we all want to answer. And so you ask these things, and then I can see you are all sort of jostling for position. If I may start off on this one, I mean, Ron referred to the Eastern question. And the Eastern question was less, what do we do about this ailing Ottoman Empire? It's more to do with how do we agree among ourselves on how to divvy up the lands so that the collapse of the Ottoman Empire does not lead to European continental wars. The Eastern question was actually always a European question. And with the outbreak of the war, the one agreement we all forget is the Constantinople Agreement, which is concluded in March of 1915, even before the beginning of the Gallipoli campaign. And it really set in motion the whole partition process, or diplomacy process, right through the war years. And it was Russia who knew precisely what it wanted in the Ottoman Empire. I've already referred to their claims to the Straits and Constantinople. And they wanted an agreement firm with Britain and France on those territorial aims. And so they initiated diplomacy in February of 1915. The French were very quick to agree, but said they wanted Syria and Cilicia, the area around the Adana coast, in return. Yeah. Interestingly enough, Imperial Britain didn't know what it wanted. And so it said they would sign on without prejudice, that they would claim a territory of equal value to them as and when they declared it. It turned out to be Mesopotamia. But in March of 1915, we know that Britain didn't enter into the conflict with the Ottoman Empire with specific territorial ambitions. It just didn't want to be left out of the grab. And that sets the tone for everything that's to follow. The next of the partition diplomacy is going to be between Britain and the Sharifs of Mecca to draw them into the conflict in the Arab Revolt. That has much more to do with Britain trying to harness Arab nationalism to foster internal dissent in the Ottoman Empire than any genuine support for Arab nationalism. Nationalism, of course, was anathema to the British as imperialists. When they concluded that agreement, conceding an Arab kingdom to the Hashemites, they knew they had to go back to the French and find out what were the boundaries of that Syria that they'd agreed to give them the Constantinople agreement that maybe they'd now contradicted with their agreements with the Hashemites. And then when it comes to Balfour, it's when the British, having fought their way through the Sinai, having just broken through the gates of Gaza, realize that they actually want to retain Palestine not as an international solution, but to secure it for their own rights, to protect the Suez Canal. That you have this sort of ongoing process of constant renegotiation of what territorial ambitions would be in the course of the war. The diplomacy was as fluid as the warfare, and the ambitions of the territory changed across the board. And any instrument they could use, Armenian, Arab, Kurd, they deployed towards their own ends.
I remember reading in your book, Professor MacMillan, this wonderful anecdote of, at the end of the war, I think David Lloyd George looking at a map of the Middle East and saying, kind of deciding what bits he wants for Britain and saying, yes, I like that, what's in Syria? Nothing there, so the French can have it. And that kind of speaks to what you're saying about the fluidity of the situation. But at the same time, and coming back to a point you'd made earlier, these were people, say in Paris or London or wherever, kind of deciding what the boundaries would look like on the ground, but there were actually people on the ground who were challenging what those boundaries might be. We, of course, have, the Arab Revolt, but most importantly, perhaps, in one way, Atatürk and Turkey, they managed to kind of reject the kind of peace that the Allies want to impose. I thought I'd ask you, what perhaps makes it easier for the Allies to impose a certain kind of peace on certain regions, and makes it easier, or not easier, but actually allows certain players to come in and actually manage to reject that kind of peace. Do you think it's a structural issue? Is it just force of personality? What actually happens?
I think what's important to remember, and just to build on what Eugene was saying, is that a lot of it was very fluid. I mean, during the war, it wasn't at all clear. We now know who won, but it wasn't at all clear until the summer of 1918 who was going to win. And so a lot of what they did was making policy on the fly. A lot of what they also did during the war was sort of sit around. I mean, lots of foreign officers were saying, well, if we win, what would we like? And they had shopping lists, which were in their back pockets, often quite dusty, saying, well, we've always really wanted that. You also had the added complication of India playing, still part of the British Empire, but the Indian government playing its own role, saying, well, we want to make sure that southern Mesopotamia, the area around Basra, is not left to anyone else because it's important for us. We want to make sure that the Suez Canal is safe because that's vital for us. And so it's very, very fluid. But what also makes it complicated is that at the end of the war, not all the different bits of the Ottoman Empire are as developed, have as developed national movements as others. There's a strong sense of Turkish identity, and there's a strong sense of Egyptian identity, and a strong, deeply rooted Egyptian national movement. but there is not yet a strong sense of an Arab identity. I mean, Arabs, are they part of, are they citizens of Damascus? Are they citizens of the Ottoman Empire? Are they part of a greater Arab nation? I mean, these are still questions that are up for grabs. There is virtually no Kurdish identity in spite of what the Kurds now would like to think. I mean, there are a few intellectuals sitting around in Istanbul saying, wouldn't it be nice if we one day had a Kurdistan? And I think that's what also makes it difficult. I mean, yes, you do have the people on the ground, some of whom are quite well organized, some of whom haven't yet begun to think that they need to be organized in this way. And then, of course, you also have the powers who, when the war ends, say, well, we've got to get something out of this. And all these sort of ideas and promises that have been made during the war, often in haste, now suddenly have to be dealt with. And so you get these complications with the Balfour Declaration promising a Jewish homeland in what is Arab territory. You have the MacMillan, the Hussein-MacMillan letters saying something which seems to be rather different. You have Sykes-Picot, which is different again. I don't think they ever thought the bill would come home. I mean, they were just making policy on the fly.
The war is an imperial war, you might say, but it's interesting that at the same time, it's an anti-imperialist war. That is, or at least there's both the nationalist movement we've been talking about, and there's also the Russian Revolution, and Lenin's claims about national self-determination, Wilson's echoing of these things. He's come out of the socialist movement originally, but is then taken over by this somewhat liberal American president. This is a period also in which there's the beginnings of what we might call modern human rights. There's this declaration by the Allies in May of 1915 when the Turks are massively deporting and massacring Armenians, that they will be held responsible. And it's the first time that crimes against humanity is mentioned in an international document. So a whole slew of different things are coming out. And Margaret said this at the very beginning. This war is transformative. The world that was known, the Edwardian world or whatever, before this, the Gilded Age, whatever, before 1914, is going to be totally transformed by 1918, by the Russian Revolution, by Wilsonianism, by the rise of the nationalism, the Arab revolt, and the game is off. And it's a new game that's going to be played internationally.
The other question that I had for you was, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the kind of ideas of self-determination. How early or how late in the war do you think they start to really impact those ideas of national identity? How do they actually impact the way? So we know that when the peace is being negotiated, this idea of mandates comes up. So you can't really have a colony anymore, you have to have a mandate. How does that impact how people on the ground in the Middle East are thinking about their future? How does it impact what they're thinking about in terms of national identity, in terms of determination? Are they happy, unhappy with the idea of being a mandate? These are questions that are they being debated?
I think certainly as far as the Arabs were concerned, there was no intention they were going to be a mandate. I mean, the Arab revolt happened because the Arabs believed and still claim they were led to believe by the British that they would be given full and free rule over their lands. And their lands, as far as they were concerned, was everything that is now Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and up through and Lebanon and Palestine. Yeah. I mean, there was no sort of halfway measure, as far as I understand it. That's what they were fighting for.
Well, that's what the Hashemites were fighting for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, you had many variants of Arab visions that were at one and the same time being played out. That you had a distinct politics around, let us say, Mount Lebanon or Libanism. You had a sort of Syrian national idea in its germination. You had a similar idea around Iraq. We always neglect Ibn Saud's expanding kingdom, but it was an uncomfortable reality for the Hashemites. His forces were proving far more zealous and far more successful than were those of the Hashemite armies. And the idea that there was one Arab view on what kind of future they were aspiring for was exactly what was missing. Even in the conduct of the Arab revolt itself, there was such a low degree of participation by Arabs across the empire. It really was a localized fight confined more or less to the area along the Hijaz Railway, but never the massive uprising of the Arab peoples trying to throw off the Ottomans and seek their own rule. But the one thing they knew they didn't want was that European rule.
Yeah.
And so mandates...
And yet, curiously, they were fighting with British gold. I mean, if there wasn't British gold, I wonder whether there would have been an Arab revolt.
But only those who received British gold fought with the Arab Revolt,
Yeah,
which is why it never became a mass movement.
Yeah.
Again, we keep saying the overstating the nationalism.
Yeah.
We can overstate the Arab Revolt. It was a very small movement, and it drew on a very tiny margin of the population of the Arab world. But the Arab world had one idea in common, which is that they did not wish to be ruled by non-Muslims, by Europeans, by foreigners.
Yeah.
And so the idea that mandates was in some way a middle ground between national self-determination and outright imperial rule never persuaded the Arab public. They saw the concept of mandates as imperialism by another name, and they fought against it in Egypt in 1919, not a mandate, but certainly in Iraq in 1920, 1925 in Syria.
Yeah.
It was not the solution that anyone aspired to.
Yeah.
Once Wilson, Lenin, whomever, raises this idea of national self-determination, and we've had this kind of talk about the nation as the source of legitimacy for states from the French Revolution on. But in World War I, once this principle is expressed, then everyone has to sort of make a claim that we're also a nation over here. Don't forget us. And it's not clear what the principles would be. But in order to, from this period on, really, the name of the game is nation. And if you want to ultimately have state power, or a degree of autonomy, but really state power, then you need to be a nation in the League of Nations, what will become the United Nations. And that's a very new and ultimately subversive principle. Because one, it means that empires who are going to fight hard to survive are now less legitimate, or at least their legitimacy can be questioned. And think about the movement in India between the wars with Gandhi, etc. So this is a struggle is going to ensue for the next 20, 25 years. And secondly, very importantly, nationalism also is a philosophy that the nation and the state ought to, if possible, be congruous. They ought to be the same, which means that you've got to get rid of or dominate others, minorities. And this leads to the disaster of genocide as well, which becomes a real feature of the 20th century.
I think sometimes we can be too sentimental about nation states. I mean, the ethnically based nation state can be enormously intolerant, if not murderous, of those who don't belong. I mean, part of ethnic nationalism, and I would distinguish it from a sort of civic patriotism when you say, I think my country's okay. I mean, I think Canada's okay, but I don't think it's all based on particular race or particular type of person. But the nationally based ethnic states, I think, are terrifying, because what they're saying is, we're us and you're not. You don't belong. You don't fit in. You're not part of us. And that leads, as we see, to horrors. I think also, I think the emergence of nationalism, it's going on. I mean, Woodrow Wilson actually said, I think it was in 1920, he said, if I'd realized quite how many nations were out there, I would never have uttered those words.
Insight, finally.
Yes.
No, but that's definitely true in the Middle East. You kind of see the kind of ethno-nationalism of the Turks, which kind of also excludes the Arabs, and I think one of, well, probably a kind of foresight in the way the Turks decide to fix their boundaries is that it's a very contained idea of a nation. They don't want to reach out to the Arabs any longer. They pretty much decided that's not for them, and they leave the Arabs to fight it out with the Europeans in a way. I kind of wanted to perhaps move the discussion a bit to the present, especially given what's happening in the Middle East. And I thought, well, Eugene and Anthony, you particularly travel through the region a lot. And in recent months and in the last year or so, there has been a lot of talk about what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Iraq with the rise of Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, however you decide to call them. And the way in which they are kind of referring back to history and kind of arguing that they are challenging the kind of borders that were imposed on them. I thought I'd first of all ask you, what has your experience been when you travel in the region? Is the kind of post-war border settlement something that is still talked about when people talk about, what shape countries in the Middle East have taken?
I mean, the most obvious example of that is Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, which now sits on both Iraq and Syria and straddles the border that was established effectively by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I think it's on YouTube. There's a video of them actually sort of ploughing over the border and sort of, Sykes-Picot, you are now dead, and sort of claim, as though to claim, they've now moved on in history. But on the ground, I mean, that's not what you hear. I mean, the Sykes-Picot, up until very, very recently, was almost never referred to. The really burning issue has always been the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the State of Israel, which is much more problematic for the region and has been up until the appearance of Daesh. I think, yes, there are, of course, the nations that were created. I mean, you look at Lebanon, for instance, with the civil wars and you look at all the wars that have happened in the region, but particularly the Arab-Israeli wars have been the things that have traumatized that region, and I think have led to the situation we have now. And that's Balfour, that's not the drawing of the line.
Yeah.
I totally agree, and I think...
Oh, good.
Actually, it's really boring. I totally disagree. I think the past century turned these artificial realities into concrete nation states.
Yeah.
We can all accept that the genesis of these states was illegitimate and imperialist in its conception. But it would be a mistake to believe that Syrians do not have an identity today distinct from Iraqis or from Jordanians. They do. And it's not because the way in which the boundary was drawn was illegitimate that you have ISIS straddling Iraq and Syria. It's far more a reflection of the way in which governments have been overthrown in Iraq and Syria, leaving power vacuums and leaving disenchanted Sunni populations who have fallen in line with a utopian Sunni vision of domination. That, though they might like to claim some legitimacy through overturning imperialist acts, it really has more to do with the power vacuum that's emerged in the Middle East since the toppling of Saddam Hussein by an American invasion in 2003, so very much by exterior forces there, but the collapse of the power of the Syrian regime since 2011 through what is basically a civil war within Syria itself. And I think in that sense, we can get over enthusiastic about the legacy of Sykes-Picot.
Oh.
I do hear it invoked. I was just in a meeting in Amman.
Yeah.
The Jordanians there were all quite obsessed with Sykes-Picot.
Yeah.
But the one that strikes me as a parting shot, since writing The Fall of the Ottomans, I wasn't sure because I dealt with the Armenian genocide as a genocide, and I didn't know whether I was burning my bridges with Turkey. Indeed, it's the opposite. I keep getting invited back. But the thing that I am struck with constantly by my Turkish hosts is how aggrieved they are still about the Arab revolt. And if they were willing to write off the Arab lands and the Kemalist revolution and the National War of Independence in 1922, 23, it's because they viewed the Arabs as having betrayed them, as having stabbed them in the back. And the thing that shocks me is that while they might have thought that in 23, I'm surprised to hear people say it to me in 2016.
Yeah.
There's one more big problem coming up, and I won't say it will be the greatest problem, but it'll be one of the greatest, and that's the Kurdish question.
Yeah.
So here's people that was largely left out, not mentioned in really Sykes-Picot except as an autonomous region. But now, one of the most effective elements against ISIS, allies of the United States, who on several occasions have betrayed the Kurds in the past. That seems to be the pattern of the Kurdish national struggle. But this is a big question because, as Margaret mentioned, Turkey decided sometime in the late part of the war, but really with Kemal's movement against the Greeks and others, the Armenians, in the early 1920s, to form an ethno-national state. And everyone in that state was going to be Turkish, including the millions of Kurds who would be Turkish, mountain Turks or something of that sort. And the Kurds ultimately never accepted that, and themselves began to generate out of their various asherets and tribes and whatever, a sense of some kind of Kurdish identity, perhaps a Kurdish nation. What's really interesting now is that the Kurdish leadership, at least a significant part of them, has decided that maybe an independent nation state won't be the future, but some kind of autonomy, even transnational autonomies that will become a state. The Turkish government has decided against this and has launched a vicious war in southeastern Turkey and against Kurds in Rojava, western Kurdistan, that is Syrian Kurdistan, and even Iraqi Kurdistan, where they're more friendly to them, against the Kurdish movement in general. That seems to me really the wave of something we have to watch very carefully. It complexifies, it makes much more complex this struggle against ISIS because the Turks are on every side all at once.
And I think one of the most difficult things we face as we think of how you build states that work effectively and protect their minorities, because the danger of majorities is they can oppress minorities if they see them as somehow, particularly if they see them as somehow different. And I do think we need to think more about different kinds of states. I mean, my own country, Canada, is a country in which we have a considerable amount of autonomy within the provinces, and that is particularly important for the French-speaking province, or the predominantly French-speaking province of Quebec, where separatist feeling, I think, has been mollified and in a sense co-opted by a considerable degree of decentralization, so that in Quebec, education is controlled by the state provincial government. The provincial government has decreed that French will be the language of business. Culture is managed by the local government, which means that we can coexist with each other, and means that there are also some protections for French minorities elsewhere in Canada and some protections for English minorities in Quebec. And the dangerous thing, I think, again to go back to the nation state, is the way in which it treats its minorities. Even if it doesn't expel them or kill them, it tends to deprive them of full citizenship. And I think this is we're seeing very clearly in the case of Turkey, and it's really regrettable because in so many ways Turkey has built a very effective, functioning and deeply rooted democratic state, but it is not treating the Kurds democratically.
And there is a potential solution, and I think Canada is a good model. That is, there's this thing called federalism. Yeah. That is some kind of oxymoron, shared sovereignty. Yeah. You have a bit of power, we have a bit of power. That would be a way out. That's what the Kurds actually want in Turkey. That's what the Eastern Ukrainians, under Russian influence, want in Ukraine. That is, there's a sense in which that solution is very suspect, both in Ukraine and in Turkey, because of the experience of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a kind of pseudo-federal state, unlike the United States and Canada, and it fell apart in any case. And so people in Ukraine, people in the Turkish government are wary about a federal solution. But I don't see any solution besides that.
Coming back to that point, don't you think it's also suspect because of that history of minorities kind of getting a sense of nationalism and wanting to break away from the empire? So you have that in the Balkans, of course, but then with the Armenians and the Arabs to a certain extent, this sense of we've been stabbed in the back by our minorities, so what we want is an ethnically coherent state, because that's the only way in which the state will be viable and not break up in the future. I find that very interesting because it's something that's very relevant to India. Given the amount of diversity we have, how do you actually ensure that a state doesn't break up? When you look at the Middle East now, the state of the minorities there is a very tragic thing. And I do agree with Professor MacMillan that needing to protect the minorities is a very important aspect of maintaining.
And there's one group we haven't mentioned at all in this, and who I think are absolutely key, and that is the Palestinians, who are badly impacted by the post-First World War settlement and by the Balfour Declaration, the creation of the State of Israel, and an awful lot of the bad things that have happened in the regions, since the First World War have happened because of the problem of the Palestinians. Yeah. And I think until that is resolved, that's going to rumble on and on.
Yeah, clearly lots of things in movement that still have to perhaps reach conclusion somehow or the other. I'll kind of close on that note, but ask if I can open up to the audience to ask their questions, of which I'm sure there are many. I can see lots of hands up. I would request people not to make statements, please. Please, we don't want any other parallel presentations after our speakers have already spoken. But please ask questions and please try to be short.